back in March, when COVID came, we switched. We did the I Am series, the 7 Statements of Jesus Christ, and we put the book of Acts on hold. So we're back 4 months later, and we're going to look at the book of Acts. And I thought, you know what? I'm rusty. You're probably rusty. We're going to do a little bit of a review on this today. We're calling this series Adventures in Acts, and believe it or not, we're up to Acts 17. We only have about 10 or 11 chapters to go, and that'll go rather quickly. But it deals with the birth and the growth of the Church of Jesus Christ. What's amazing to me is the story of Acts continues up until this day, and it will go on beyond us. The story of the church and its development and its growth. If you look over there on the banner, in 1846, this church was established. So we have 200 and some years of, well, are we at 200? No, not yet. We're close to it. We have 150 years of ministry and various ministers and pastors and congregations here through this building and this church. And we're part of that story. We're an extension of the book of Acts. But I want to go back to the whole purpose of the book of Acts. Acts chapter 1 and verse 8 is the key passage, the key verse in the book of Acts. And Jesus said to his followers, his disciples, "You will be my witnesses," in Acts 1:8. It's just an extension that if you belong to Jesus Christ, you're going to represent Jesus Christ in the world. You will be my witnesses. And then this all unfolds. As you complete that passage in Acts 1:8, it says, "You'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in Judea and to the remotest parts of the earth." Guess where we are today? In New Albany. The remotest parts of the earth. You may not think so. We are so American-centered, we think that the center of the universe is the United States. It definitely is not. The church started in Jerusalem with a Jewish group of believers who trusted Jesus Christ, and it spread out. What's Judea? Jerusalem's the city, it's the capital of Israel. Since 1948, they've been back in the land. But what is that term Judea, what does that mean? What town are we in? New Albany. What state are we in? What county are we in? Bradford County. Okay, we do the same thing that they did. Jerusalem is the town, the city. The province it's in, almost like Bradford County, or maybe more like a state, is Judea. You have Judea, you have Samaria to the north of Judea, and then you have Galilee in the north. Those 3 major provinces. There's some others. Perea is one that's over towards the Jordan River a little bit more. But he said it's going to start at that pinpoint place in Jerusalem. It's going to spread out, and eventually it's going to go to the whole world. So we start with that witness in Jerusalem, and it's the first 6 chapters of the book of Acts. Now, this might seem like a dry history lesson, and it's going to have to be for a little bit, but I want you to get a grip on how this great movement of God is working and still 2,000 years later continues to work. So the birth of the church, if someone were to ask you, how do I know about how the church started, where it started, you take them to Acts chapter 2. The day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit came upon the believers, mostly Jewish believers that were gathered there, and that was the birth of the church. Now, it wasn't any particular denomination. You didn't have Baptists back then, you didn't have Presbyterians, you didn't have Methodists, you didn't have Episcopalians, none of those things. It was just one church coming out of Judaism, and it was centered in Jerusalem. Those denominations wouldn't come along for another 1,500 years with the Protestant Reformation. The growth of the church then at Jerusalem is in chapters 3 through 6, and they just multiplied and multiplied, and there was certainly resistance. Now the witness that spread out into all Judea and Samaria comes in Acts 6 through Acts 9. In Acts 9, something significant happens. Saul is converted. They change his name to Paul, and he becomes a dynamic spokesperson, a regenerated, redeemed Jewish Pharisee who turned to Jesus Christ and wrote perhaps the bulk of our New Testament. And as that spread out in chapter 7, Stephen is the first Christian martyr, first person to lose his life. Paul was there holding their cloaks, consenting to the stoning of Peter. There was a lot of tension that was growing. And another thing that happened in this time is that Philip moves to Samaria temporarily, and he begins to minister to those who are Samaritans. Now, who are the Samaritans? Anybody know? This is where we get your history. Samaritans are half Jewish, half Gentile. In 722, when the Assyrian Empire, where's my VBS class? You know where the Assyrian Empire is. What nation today is Assyria? Iran, very good, Sarah. Iran is where Assyria is. In 722 BC, those 10 nations, those 10 tribes of Israel were scattered as part of God's judgment. And the Samaritans, the Jews at that time, there in Samaria, intermarried with the Gentiles. And so they were a mixed group of people. All right, another pop quiz. What's the nation that took Ezekiel and Daniel captive in the 680s? Anybody know? 680 BC. About 100 years, well, not quite 100 years, maybe 50 years later. It was Babylon. And where's Babylon located today? Iraq, exactly. And so you say to yourself, why do we hear so much in the news about Iran, Iraq, the Middle East, everything else? It's because this is part of God's program, and he's been using those nations for his purposes. And so he wanted to extend, he didn't want just a Jewish church in Jerusalem. You know, you would have been excluded. I would have been excluded. How many of you have a Jewish background? I don't. Right? Most of us do not. And the Gentiles are the rest of the nations. And God said, I have a heart for them. So he went from the purebred Jewish individuals who would have nothing to do with the Samaritans. They looked down on the Samaritans. To the gospel coming to those who were half Jewish, half Gentile. And you know what it tells us? God is not a respecter of persons. God looks at all of us. He looks at our hearts. And he loves us all equally. There is, you know, the whole tension we have in liking and disliking people in our nation is just crazy, because if you had God's mindset, you would learn to love everyone. Even if they weren't Christian, even if you didn't agree with them, you would learn to love them as part of God's creation. So this ministry of Philip goes out to Samaria, and then it extends as well. Philip goes to the Ethiopian eunuch. Now, Ethiopian eunuch, where was he from? Ethiopia, very good, yes. So he was a native African. And as a result, Philip went to him, and he was in a powerful position as a eunuch for one of the queens, for one of the royalty there. And he came to Christ and then spread the gospel as well. And then finally, in Acts chapter 9, the conversion of Saul. Now I want to show you this. I don't know how much of it you can see, but this movement started in Jerusalem, and you're going to see it move up to Antioch, and that's the second church base. We'll get to that. Ministry goes over here to Tarshish and all over to Ephesus, up in these areas, and we'll see that on his missionary journeys. And then the third part, not only in Jerusalem and in Judea and Samaria, but then the witness to the remotest parts of the earth, to everywhere where we are. There was a second church based in Antioch. So the second home switched from Jerusalem, where the apostles were staying, and it spread out to the north, to Antioch, in Acts chapters 9 through 12. And then Peter, it's not going to the Jewish people, it's not going to half Jewish, half Gentile. Now Peter goes to Cornelius, who was Italian, and he's the first of the Gentiles, complete Gentiles, that God reaches out to with the gospel. And remember, Peter took some convincing. He was a good, solid Jewish individual, and he's like, that message is not for the Gentiles. He had a lot of prejudice. He really did, and God had to get him over that. And then the church in Jerusalem is persecuted in chapter 12 of Acts, and that allows things to extend a little bit in terms of starting the missionary journeys. I want to show you, then Paul begins his first missionary journey. This is AD 44 to 46. And I want you to see where he goes. It's based out of Antioch, that second base. Down here is Jerusalem. And so a lot of movement is here. Now, they keep going back and forth to Jerusalem because Jerusalem is still kind of a headquarters where all the knowledgeable Jewish Christians are. But he starts from Antioch. He goes to the little island of Cyprus. Goes here to Pisidian, Antioch, Perga, Iconium, Derbe. This is where he meets Timothy and Timothy's mother and grandmother. And then he goes to Lystra and then does some backtracking. That's the first missionary journey in chapters 13 and 14. We've covered that already. And it's around that area of Asia Minor. And then they come back to Jerusalem because there's a question. It's called the Jerusalem Council. And they're saying, what does a Gentile have to do to become a Christian, to get into heaven? Do they have to become Jewish? Because there were a lot of people, Jewish people, who became Christians down in Jerusalem, and they said, you got to keep the law of Moses. You got to go back to the Ten Commandments. You got to do all these kinds of things. And they had a council together, and the Christian leadership said, no, let's not put those burdens on people. Could you imagine if, we recently took in some members, could you imagine if our membership was, a whole bunch of hoops that you had to jump through? That would be wrong. You need to be here every Sunday. Now, we want you to be here every Sunday that you can, but the reality is that's just not practical. For people. There are people who work in the service industries, and we understand that as church. But could you imagine if there was a rule that said, not only do you need to do that, you need to keep all the 10 Commandments, not only the 10 Commandments, the 613 dietary laws that are there in the Old Testament, because that's what being a Jew would be. You could only walk or travel a certain distance on the Sabbath. Oh, and by the way, you'd keep the Sabbath too. You'd worship on Saturday, not Sunday. So could you imagine if they put all of that on them and they said, no, we're not going to do that. If you have a relationship with Jesus Christ, then you have eternal life. That's between you and God, and we really want to encourage that. And we don't want to put any other burdens on you except to keep yourself sexually pure. And in that context, don't eat meats offered to idols. Now, when's the last time you went to a barbecue and had meat offered to idols? I would have to say probably never, because you don't travel in those circles. That doesn't happen anymore. But that was a big issue in first century Christianity as they were coming out of Judaism. So this is what the Jerusalem Council determined. Then Paul goes on the second missionary journey, and that's chapters 15 through 18. And we're up to chapter 17 today in our study. That's a ministry in the Aegean area. I'll show you that in a moment, through chapter 16 to 19. And a call to Macedonia to bring the gospel, and some conflict and some pressure. And that's where we are today. Places like Thessalonica, Berea, Philippi, ministry in Achaia. And I know a lot of this doesn't mean much to you. And then the conclusion of the second missionary journey in Ephesus, in chapter 18, then the ministry in Ephesus, where Paul is there with the Ephesian elders, and he thinks he's going to be put to death. He thinks he's never going to see them. Again, that's later on in the book of Acts. So I want to show you, this is that second missionary journey. from AD 49 to 52. And again, it starts in Antioch, Tarshish, which is the hometown of the Apostle Paul, goes to Derbe, Iconium, Lystra, up in the region of Galatia, to Troas, to Philippi, where there's the Philippian jailer and that great conversion of the Philippian jailer, and then there's also Lydia. And then right now we stop in Thessalonica in chapter 17, where we'll pick it up today. But then he will go on to Berea, and then down to Athens, and to the Corinthian church, and then to Ephesus. And this is where, with John later, the Isle of Patmos, and around Ephesus, where the book of Revelation will have been written. And then back to Caesarea. But let me continue this outline to the end of the book. This is the third missionary journey from chapters 18 to chapter 21 with the Apostle Paul. And in this expansion, the uttermost parts of the earth, the church reaches Rome, and that takes us to the end of the book of Acts. Paul is captive in Jerusalem in chapter 21, chapter 22, and chapter 23. And then Paul is moved to Caesarea, which is up along the coast where Herod's castle and prison is, and that's in chapters 23 to 26, and we'll look at that. And then Paul is captive at Rome, and then guess what happens? No more Paul. All right? As far as we know, that's where he was imprisoned and executed, and that ends the book of Acts. This is the third missionary journey. And again, Antioch, that region again, Paul goes back and confirms with all the disciples. Macedonia, Philippi, again, Corinth, down some of these islands where Paul talks about being shipwrecked and having difficulty. Southern end of the island of Cyprus, Phoenicia, and then this is Caesarea where he would eventually be imprisoned, but all the way back to Jerusalem, and then it finishes the book of Acts. That was a lot. Now, I don't expect that you're going to remember that. But I want to pick it up in Thessalonica. Because if you look at the two little books, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, what are they all about? Paul writes to them, and 1 Thessalonians, he says, work while you wait. Now, you've heard the expression, whistle while you work. He's saying, work while you wait. Wait for what? Wait for Jesus to return. In Thessalonica, they weren't the most academic individuals. In fact, Paul's going to say that when he moved on to Berea, the Bereans were more noble. They checked out the scriptures. Thessalonica, they were a little bit lazy. And so someone told them, well, you missed it. Jesus came back and, or Jesus is coming back and there's no point working. Wouldn't you love to do that? All right. If you knew Jesus was coming back tomorrow, would you go to work tomorrow? I wouldn't. Probably not. But you don't know that. You don't know when he's coming back. And the Thessalonians, I mean, they were dressing in white robes. They were going and standing on hillsides, and they were not working. And Paul said, listen, if you're not willing to work, don't let them eat. That's kind of harsh. Don't feed them. All right? I mean, we live in a culture where we have compassion on people, and, if they don't work, we try to feed them if they're out of work. But Paul said, listen, if you're capable of working and you're not working, guess what? Go hungry. Pretty harsh. Now, if you're not capable of working, Paul said we should take care of you. That's what a society does, and that's particularly what Christians do. Well, they were standing around waiting for the Lord to return, and Paul says, work while you wait for the Lord to return. Get busy about things. And so we pick it up in Acts chapter 17, where Paul first meets the Thessalonians, and it says, when Paul and his companions had passed through Amphipolis, and I can never pronounce this word. Amphipolis is what it is. It's Amphipolis and Apollonia. They came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. The reason they didn't stop in the other towns is you had to have a certain population, certain stipulations to have a synagogue there. And so Paul passed through there, but he didn't stop, he didn't preach. Instead, he came to Thessalonica because there was a Jewish synagogue there, and that was his custom. Paul went to the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days, so he stayed for at least 3 weeks. On 3 Sabbath days, he reasoned with them from the Scriptures. And here's what he said. Paul took what Scriptures? Did he take the book of Thessalonians? No. Did he take the book of Acts? No. What Scriptures did he take? The Old Testament. That's the only thing they had. They were just in the process of writing and compiling the stories of the New Testament, but he couldn't take that until when he was writing to Colossians or Ephesians, and those letters would get circulated. But right now, he's talking to a Jewish audience in a synagogue saying, let me tell you this story of Jesus. Let me tell you how we have the Messiah. And again, there in the Second Missionary Journey, he's at Thessalonica, just came from Philippi, and will go on to Berea. In Acts chapter 17 and verse 3, he was explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. The concept of the Messiah was a well-ingrained idea from the Old Testament. Every Jewish person was looking for a Messiah. Do you know what Messiah means? Mashiach, Christ, the Anointed One. Basically, it's the concept that Israel is downtrodden and their savior, their rescuer. They thought it was political, but he's going to come. And so for centuries, because of the teachings of Isaiah, the teachings of Jeremiah, because of the work of Moses, because of promises to Abraham and David and Solomon, they expected a Messiah. And so after the death and the resurrection of this Messiah, Paul is coming, and he's standing in the synagogue in Thessalonica, and he's saying, I want to explain something to you. This is my only mission. I want to tell you that the Messiah that you think about from the Old Testament wasn't going to be a king immediately. He was going to suffer and rise from the dead. And then he said, I've got news for you. This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is that Messiah. He's the one you waited for. Now, there's always a response when you hear something about a spiritual decision. If I tell people Jesus is the only way to heaven, some people are going to say, yes, that's true, we agree with you. Some people are going to say, you've got to be kidding me. There's a dozen paths to God. All you got to do is think one in your mind, and you can get there. Or you can be like a Hindu and have, 300,000 gods. Pick one. And some people are going to get very, very angry about it. So some of the Jews had the same response. They were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas. Silas was Paul's traveling companion, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks or Gentiles. So there was a following here in every town where Paul went and spoke in the synagogues. And quite a few prominent women. There were women who were leaders in various towns, people like Lydia and others, and they responded to the gospel, and they said, yes, Jesus is that Messiah. Now, I want to tell you something. Riots are not new things. You turn on the television and you see what's going on. That woke you up, didn't it? Riots are not new things, okay? A riot is about to ensue in Thessalonica, verse 5. But other Jews, this is the other response, they were jealous. So they rounded up some bad characters. I love that expression. Now, I don't care what you think about President Trump. You should give him respect because he's president. You can agree with him, disagree with him. I'm hardly ever political on all those things. But I'm going to tell you, there's a place where President Trump is biblical because he uses that expression. He says there are bad characters out there, and we need to do something about the bad characters. Well, it's no different. 2,000 years ago, the Jews were jealous. They didn't like this new movement. It threatened their livelihood. It threatened their power, their political power, their religious power. So they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace. And they formed a mob. See how easy it is to incite a mob, even back then? And started a riot in the city. Bet you didn't know that. Thessalonica. They could have burned the place down. We don't know what happened. They rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul. Paul and Silas were staying with this believer, Jason, in order to bring them out to the crowd. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some other believers before the city officials, shouting. Now remember, these are religious leaders. That's how out of whack we can get. These men have caused trouble all over the world, and now they've come here, and Jason has welcomed them into his home. And furthermore, now you got to understand with the Jewish political leaders, Jewish religious leaders, they only wanted Caesar, they only wanted to call on the Emperor Caesar when it was convenient for them. So they trump this up and they say they are all defying Caesar's decree. What's Caesar's decree? Basically, it's, I'm God. As the emperor, Caesar demanded worship. And you could be put to death if you didn't worship Emperor Caesar, whichever members of the Caesar family were in power at any particular time. And these people are saying there's another king, one called Jesus, this King Jesus. And when they heard this, the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil. So this was a mess. It might not have been as violent as some of the things that we've seen. And there's some sad, sad stuff going on in our country. But they made Jason and the others post bond and let them go. Why did they post a bond? They posted a bond so that Paul and Silas, they guaranteed they wouldn't come back. If they came back, Jason would lose his bond money. So they needed to warn him. And what happens then, and we'll pick it up next week, is Paul moves on, goes a little bit south from Thessalonica to Berea, and he says there, the Christians were more noble. Now here's my challenge. Are you a noble Christian? Well, do you know what marked a noble Christian? They weren't perfect. They didn't do everything right in Berea. But they dug in and searched the scriptures. The Thessalonians were lazy. They didn't feel like working. Now, not every one of them, but by and large, that town, they didn't want to check things out. But Paul loved working with the Bereans because they checked out the scripture. They wanted to see, is this really what the Old Testament says? And my challenge is, if you're going to be a noble Christian, you need to get your nose in the book. This is not an hour or a half hour or 30 minutes on Sunday morning is not enough of a diet for any Christian. You need to read books about the Bible. You need to read the Bible. And I know it's difficult. I've had people who start and they give up. And I'm not saying start from Genesis and then read your way through it. I'm saying, like what we did with the VBS, the high school group, we gave them a copy of the Gospel of John. And we said, here's a challenge. Just read the Gospel of John before you go back to school. Just read it over the summer. Okay? If you don't like to read, watch a video on it. There's just hundreds of things on YouTube. You got to watch what you're learning. But there's some really, really good Bible societies out there, and they will teach you, and they will give you some good stuff. So be a noble Christian, and we're going to learn more about that next week. I want to close with this movement that's 2,000 plus years old. There's a lot of history, there's a lot of geography, there's a lot of stuff that when I was in school bored me to tears. And I may have done the same for you today. I try to make it interesting. But we do that for one reason. This is a movement of God that has happened for 2,000 years. You and I are part of it. We're going to be part of it for all of eternity. And we're going to watch what God does with the church until that time when he snatches the church out of the world. It could be tomorrow. But guess what? We may not look like it, and I've said it over and over again. In Jesus Christ, the church is the most powerful entity on the planet for spiritual change. This is the place where people need to be for growth and encouragement, and we need to be the kind of church that we should be.